Hello and welcome to this episode of the Bible Toolbox. I'm Luke.
And I'm Chris.
And we're here to help you enjoy the Bible through the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. And we are continuing our series going through the Bible Project's videos, book by book, through the New Testament, and reviewing, giving pros and cons, critiquing wherever necessary. And so here we go. Romans. So Romans is the most comprehensive treatment of Paul's thought in the New Testament. And in that way, so the Gospels they tell a narrative of what Jesus did and said, but a lot of atonement theology is like in one verse. The Son of Man came not to serve, but to give his life for a ransom of many. And that's it.
Right.
Otherwise, you watch the crucifixion happen. And so in many ways, Romans has been the most studied, debated letter of the New Testament because of its comprehensiveness. It's the longest of Paul's letters, going into detail about what the gospel is.
Because of its comprehensiveness, not necessarily because of its obvious clarity, which is an interesting distinction. The point being that there are a lot of fights about it.
So we're going into this knowing that there's tons of debates, and what we say is probably going to make someone mad. We're not going to please anyone in this, but hopefully this will be clarifying, helpful, and revealing of where issues lie. So here's the Bible Project. Their thesis is that the gospel reveals God's righteousness, creates a new humanity, fulfills God's promise to Israel, and unifies the church. And that's all I did was...
That's the outline.
That's the outline. Yeah. And they basically said this sentence in their video. And this order, where it goes from God creates the world and sin, and all humans are under wrath, then you have righteousness revealed, and this goes into being a new creature in Christ. Like Romans is the backbone of modern day systematic theology treatments, where you go from creation, fall, redemption, church, end times.
And even almost anyone who wants to summarize Paul's theology kind of uses Romans as a spine, as a way of organizing it.
So that'll get us into when we talk about what's the point of Romans. And so here, some people say it's to summarize his theology. The problem with that is that it's lacking a lot of key things, like a doctrine of the church and of the Eucharist and of eschatology. Those are big ones. And basically you can get all of those in 1 Corinthians.
So you just need only those.
You just need Romans and 1 Corinthians. Okay. But so tune in for next week to get the rest of Paul's theology.
That's interesting. No, well, I'll just say I think it's a healthy approach to the New Testament letters to take them as occasional documents, to take them as written for a specific purpose to a specific community. Romans is the toughest to remind ourselves that it's an occasional letter because it feels abstract. It feels like a theological summary. But if you get to the end, it's clearly writing to a community of real people with real concerns. The Bible Project does a good job of highlighting that in this last section, It Unifies the Church. And there's a famous study with Scott McKnight's Reading Romans Backwards that starts with those questions, which I think it's just a helpful reminder. If you're tempted to read Romans too abstractly, but Paul has specific people in mind, even if he's doing like theology proper.
Yeah. Okay, before we jump into the outline, there is a new book, 2023, I think, Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, edited by Scott McKnight, of who you just said. We'll probably be using this a lot for different topics and stuff, but it does a good job of pretty much every topic that you care about Paul, or it gives an update of where scholarship is at.
And one just further recommendation of this book is that it's not, I don't think it's too synthetic. It doesn't collapse categories too much. If they're talking about the law, for example, which we'll talk about, they'll give you summary of scholarship in Galatians and Romans and Corinthians. So they're not collapsing too much of Paul to be concise. I think it's pretty thorough.
And then the next thing I wanted to talk about is Romans has been huge in Protestant versus Catholic dialogues. And so I have two quotes here, and I want you to tell me which one is Protestant and which one is Catholic. So the first one here says, justification is also used by Paul to describe an effect worked in those who believe what God has done in Christ. Since God acquitted people in judgment, they are now justified this acquitting took place not because the people were innocent, although they were sinners. The truly innocent Jesus was himself made sin for the sake of others, and so on. You see that acquittal, free grace because of Christ. And then the second one, you can see these quotes if you watch the video here. Paul's understanding of justification as reconciliation means that a narrow judicial, sometimes juridical or forensic view of justification as divine declaration and legal fiction is simply inadequate, and so on. He goes on that we need more about the resurrection and new life.
Yeah, covenant and life. Yeah.
So the crazy thing is, the first one is a Catholic, Raymond Brown, and the second one is Michael Gorman, who's a Methodist Protestant. And this goes on. In a book by Carl Lehman, who's a Catholic, and Wolfhart Pannenberg, who's a Protestant, says they say together that this means that the mutual rejections applied even in the 16th century, they apply only to indistinct and misleading formulations. They certainly no longer apply to the partner's actual view today.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of walking back of the debate over justification in Romans isn't so much of a divide as it was in the 1600s between Protestant and Catholic anymore. A similar thing, I threw this one in for you.
Yeah.
So Aidan Kimmel, who's Eastern Orthodox, says about Robert Jensen, who's a Lutheran. Robert Jensen had long held that the Reformation teaching on justification by faith was best understood as a metalinguistic rule. Always preach the gospel as unconditional good news. If this is what justification by faith really means, I asked him, do you see the Catholic position as excluding or denying the metalinguistic rule? No, he replied. If that was the only issue at hand, I would have no problem becoming Catholic.
Strong statement.
Strong statement, but it's not the only issue.
Not, right? And he's not Catholic.
Yeah. And he founded the Center for Catholic and Evangelical Theology or whatever it was. So he knows Catholicism in and out, and he did not choose it. So that's just saying, what you think Romans is talking about justification is not a make or break whether you're Protestant or Catholic anymore.
That's helpful to summarize.
I've even heard on podcasts by Catholics, they'll say, we admit Romans is about forensic justification, juridical declaration, but that doesn't negate the wider theology of becoming righteous. And that's what
Gorman was saying.
What Gorman was saying. So just as we go on, what we just said there is going to make some people mad, but just in terms of scholarship, it's not a clear line between the Catholics all think of righteous become moral righteous, and all the Protestants think forensic justification. It's more complicated. It's more complicated than that. So then I have a quick, here's the complications, more of the different perspectives and views. So going through the history. So a major thing first is Augustine and his debates with Pelagianism. And basically the main point in that is humans are under sin, and so they can't save themselves. And so God's grace has to come first. Whatever that means, grace first. That.
And basically, most people agree on that. Catholics, Protestants.
Right. That's what I'm saying. This is a stake in the ground. Everyone has to say grace first.
Right.
And then Luther comes around, and he's looking at Catholic traditions, and he sees those as works of law, as people trying to earn their salvation. And he says, no one can earn their salvation. It needs to be divine fiat. You are righteous because of Christ, not because of anything beautiful in you. He gives the analogy of a marriage, of a bride who is poor and destitute and marries a king. And so just by the mere bond right there, you are one together, you're married, the bride instantly gets all of the benefits of the king's riches, right? Nothing to do with her worth or beauty, but
it's just true legally, and so it's true.
It's hers. So that becomes the standard Protestant reading, or the strong focus on the declarative, you are righteous because God said so.
And I'll just add, what Luther's doing there is characterizing his opponents and Paul's opponents as holding the same view, which becomes problematized later, especially in Sanders, 1977 and on. But the point being that Paul's Judaizing opponents, Luther's just reading them as the Catholics.
So then what happens there is that Judaism gets seen as a legalistic religion, and the Old Testament gets seen as a legalistic.
Right. The law is just legalism.
And that's what's going to be challenged here. One last major person in history here is Karl Barth. He's engaging with historical criticism, and his preface to Romans, his commentary on Romans is awesome. But he basically just says all these people, they're trying to reconstruct the history and the sources and the text. And he's like, guys, why don't we just read the text and talk about what it means? Because it's making claims about your life.
Right.
How are you going to be saved? So it's not as much about what the interpretation of Romans is. Bart isn't really popular for how he interprets Romans. No. It's more just like
vibes.
Let's interpret Romans.
Right.
Stop focusing on external things or peripheral things. But his view gets extended in the apocalyptic reading, so we'll get into that. But then we were talking about, so the Lutheran view in scholarship today is what's characterized or sometimes called traditional view. I've summarized here. It's the position that Romans teaches all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and therefore need to be justified and can only be justified before God because of Christ. They receive, Jesus was perfect. He lived a perfect life. He obtained righteousness, and that righteousness is then given to us, imputed to us, that we can be declared righteous before God, like that marriage analogy. So that's been the Lutheran view. And then a monumental moment in Roman scholarship is E.P. Sanders in 1977 writes a book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, where he challenges this idea that Judaism was legalistic. And he says that Jews viewed the law in terms of covenantal nomism, which just means that Jews kept the law not to save themselves, but to stay saved, right? Salvation, election was a gift, a grace from God, that they were the people of God, and you keep the law to honor that grace.
To mark your continuity within the covenant. And I'll just say, obviously, we're going to see that scholarship splinters after that, after Sanders, but almost no one challenges that thesis from Sanders. The particular thesis that the Judaism was not as legalistic as Luther and the Reformers thought it was. Everyone basically agrees that Sanders was right about that.
If people push back, it's more saying some were legalistic.
Sure. And actually, covenantal nomism as a title has been splintered. Or some people say, let's use the term variegated nomism. But you can already tell that nomism rather than legalism, nomism, which comes from the word for law, is a more popular term for this way of doing Jewish religion than legalism. In part because legalism is kind of a slur. But the idea that the law came as an act of grace from God, and election was still God's prerogative, that following the rules doesn't save you. Most of those are pretty standard. There may have been legalists in Second Temple Judaism and before, but most people agree that the Judaism that Paul's writing against was not just legalism
as a whole. So after that, so Sanders, that was a new perspective on Judaism, changing our view of Judaism. And so then that got extended to, well, then what do we do with Paul? And so that's where the new perspective on Paul shows up. And the main figures are James Dunn and N.T. Wright, which is hard because they both have very different understandings of Romans. So it's not as if they're one entity.
And they've both changed their mind on Romans. The old N.T. Wright and the new N.T. Wright are different, so it's hard to keep up with.
But my summary here is the new perspective focuses on that your privilege before God comes by faith, not by boundary markers of the law. And so here, what Dunn and Wright have in common is that they understand works of law. You're not saved by works of law, but by faith. Works of law means mainly the covenant markers, like circumcision, the food laws, the Sabbath.
Those are the big three. The
things that are distinguishing Israel from the other nations.
And saying now Christ is that marker. In Christ or not in Christ.
So it's a more horizontal focus of how Christ's salvation has extended the covenant family wider, to more horizontally, to include Gentiles. The benefit of that, especially in Romans, is if you're reading Romans backwards and you're seeing the weak and the strong in Romans 14, it makes sense of, there's an actual horizontal problem here. Divisions, boasting.
That unification of the church, is how they label that last section, is 100% in line with this.
Right. And this is anyone who holds to the Lutheran view today still,
Mm-hmm.
or would put themselves in that camp, isn't going to deny that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a focus. So
Yeah, emphasis. Yeah, for sure.
Especially today, after these debates they've been around for almost 50 years now. So
Not that.
how they started is not where they're at now.
Where have they gone?
So more positions here. So the apocalyptic is coming out of Karl Barth. And so I summarize it here. The inbreaking of Christ, this apocalyptic moment, has revealed our sin problem and the need for the Spirit. So this is basically, we normally think of, you can't understand the gospel until you understand your sin. You hear that often? That's kind of people in the Lutheran view will.
Yeah, well, and it traces the logic of Romans to a certain extent, right? Yeah.
And
to a certain extent, not completely. Romans 1 still has exalted Jesus, but anyway.
And so the Campbell is the main one in this camp, where he flips that. Mm-hmm. You can't understand your sin problem until Christ shows up and you realize the Son of God is dying before your eyes. Mm-hmm. And you have to realize that was because of me. Mm-hmm. And so my sin must be really bad because he had to die. This isn't like I needed another animal sacrifice. He reveals just how epic and horrible the sin problem is.
And how glorious and amazing the new stuff is, right? And the contrast is what makes it apocalyptic and stunning and require response.
And then next view here, participationist. This is mainly Michael Gorman. The focus here is on the in Christness, that salvation comes by embodying Christ's life and so restored with God and others. So salvation is becoming united with Christ and therefore being restored in all aspects, legally, forensically, but also morally, right? Yeah. And so that's a vertical restoration, but then we're also all in Christ, and so we're restored together socially as well. And then there is another camp called Paul within Judaism. So we talked about boundary markers being maybe the focus and Judaism not legalistic. And so now the question kind of becomes, so Gentiles are in the covenant, but what does that mean for Jews in keeping the covenant? Do they still follow covenantal nomism? Do they still keep the law?
And so they're reading Paul saying that Paul never tells Jews to stop doing these things.
Yes. Gentiles are in by faith and they keep the Acts 15 things, but Jews still, out of faithfulness to God and their election in Abraham and Moses, that they keep the law. And so would Paul have circumcised his son? They say yes, and Paul kept doing offerings and going to the temple, making vows.
Circumcised Timothy, right?
Yeah. So that position, and within this Paul within Judaism camp, there are some who just say that, which is pretty minimal, and then there's some who go even further and say Jews and Christians are saved. Jews, Gentiles are saved by different means.
Two different ways.
Gentiles by Christ, Jews by the law, which is less popular and definitely within the church that's not popular. But just realize when you hear Paul within Judaism, that can mean different things depending on which context that you're in. Another pretty big moment is John Barclay's book, Paul and the Gift, where he goes through and distinguishes different kinds of grace in the understanding of grace. And the big thing that he changed is that Paul does not believe in unconditional grace, but unconditioned grace.
And grace comes freely but requires response.
Yes. So think of this of giving it a present, a birthday present to your daughter, right? You give her a present and she goes, eh.
It breaks some kind of social contract.
It's like when I give you a gift, I expect you to thank me, or it was meant to bring us together, reconcile us, and it didn't work. And so it's not unconditional that God just saves you and expects nothing to change, but it's unconditioned. It's all freely given by God, but expects this was meant to bring you together with God, not to leave you in your sin.
And so we mentioned his book, Paul and the Gift. I'll give a plug for the shorter version of that book, which is really accessible and brilliant. You still get all the ideas. It's called Paul and the Power of Grace. Highly recommend that one.
Yeah. And then the last perspective I threw here is all the reader response, the feminist readings, the Latino readings, and so on like that. They haven't really added to what
they're asking different questions.
Yeah.
It's worth pointing out that all the ones above this, they're not just sharing their opinion on theology. They're trying to say, this is how we should read what Paul is saying.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Which is a little bit different from a reader response, which is trying to say, here's what I see in the text.
Or even, why are people across the world hearing different things?
Right.
And trying to explain.
Which is a good question.
So hopefully that history brings out some of the tensions already.
And it shows the impossibility of trying to summarize everything here for us. But.
And we could go into the Greek, and a lot of genitives are debated in Romans here that we could talk about. But in terms of the outline, that outline of 1 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 11, 12 to 16 is pretty standard besides chapter 5. So an example of a different here is Dunn, who he goes 1 to 5, and then 6 to 8, 9 to 11, and so on. And that's just pointing out that chapter 5 is a bridge chapter. It's summarizing what came before, and it's introducing what comes next. And so people are on the fence where to go with it. And it is doing both.
Yeah.
And you'll notice in the Bible Project's video, they didn't even talk about the first half of chapter 5. They just skipped right past it. And that just highlights the difficulty of knowing exactly how to place it.
Because Paul's sort of moving from a view of individual people to this new humanity that comes in the second section. So it's a bridge. I think that a bridge is a good illustration there.
And so that's another thing is the Bible Project talked about 5 to 8 as the new humanity, and people label the purpose of 5 to 8 differently. So what you were saying, 6 to 8, James Dunn says this is a new perspective of faith in relation to the individual, is 6 to 8, and then 9 to 11 is in terms of broader, like Israel or humankind. And then Schreiner talks about 5 to 8, the new thing is hope. So now that having been justified in Christ, we have peace with God, or it starts looking to the future of what is the hope? Now that we've been justified, what hope are we looking forward to? And Doug Moo has a similar idea of assurance. And so less about being made new
and more about the effects of justification. Yeah, interesting.
Some people will, especially in, I think, French scholarship, say 1 to 4 is about justification, 5 to 8 is about sanctification, like that traditional Protestant
and then glorification.
distinction, and then glory. It kind of works. That's kind of the new humanity kind of idea. It's a different word for sanctification. So I don't know if there's a crazy difference there, but
I'll just say about that framework of sanctification, the way I read at least 5 through 8, or the way we typically think of sanctification as the ongoing growth in grace and holiness for believers, I think Paul's doing something bigger than that in 5 through 8. With the links to Adam and a new humanity in Christ, I think it's getting at new creation, starting a new way of being human, which is sanctification, but it's not sanctification in the way that we often use it in the church.
Putting in wider biblical categories.
And even apocalyptic categories. There's a new kind of humanity being formed, which is surely, that's what sanctification means. But it's just, in the context of chapters 5 through 8, it's so cosmic. It's so glorious and universal. That to reduce it to progress in the individual believer feels a little bit reductive.
So what do we want to tackle now? Well, let's just go in order here. So there is huge debates over what is the theme of Romans? What is Romans about? Some people say it's all about justification by faith. Some people say it's all about being in Christ. Some people say it's about the gospel, which is what the Bible Project said. Because Romans 1, the first couple verses there, it uses the word gospel, and then that seems to be kind of like
heading.
I like the idea of I think the Bible Project has this right, that gospel as the main theme of Romans. I think is good, and it includes all those things.
It's a big category.
It's a big category.
The book about good news.
And then huge, we get chapter 1, verse 16 and 17.
I'm not ashamed
of the gospel, for it's the power of God. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And so this is where we get all of these genitive debates. So righteousness of God, what does that mean? is that, as the Bible Project says, God's own attribute, right? It's God's character, it's God's faithfulness, it's God's right acting towards his people, towards the covenant. Is it a gift?
The way God makes people righteous.
Yeah. Like God, the righteousness from God, we might say.
God gives. Yeah.
Or is this righteous living before God? How we become morally whole, morally
righteousness
well.
in God's opinion.
And probably the answer to this is yes, all three. And the way I've heard it said is, if you talk about the goodness of God, I'm experiencing the goodness of God. We think of that in all of these categories, right? We think of it as God's attribute, but it's also deeply experienced. So it's not a separate idea. And so as we read Romans, it's not so much of which understanding here, it's not exclusive.
Right.
We don't need to read righteousness of God the same way every time, but kind of which aspect here is being emphasized.
Right. And I think it does vary.
Because there's times when it seems like the law, chapter 3, where we're all guilty before God, and therefore we need the righteousness of God, seems to be God's gift. But then there's other times where it talks about God is faithful to perform his promise, and you can, especially that 9 to 11. Let's go to justification.
I'll just point out one last thing on that. The gospel, he's saying, is the righteousness of God. So already you have debates about, well, however we feel the gospel, how does that relate to the righteousness of God in the Old Testament? And if this is the way to be morally upstanding before God, what then about the law? And all the interpretive frameworks we just saw are going to disagree about answering those kinds of questions. And they're not easy questions. And Paul may even answer those questions in multiple ways in this book. There might not be one answer. So
Sure. So let's talk about justification. I think Protestants kind of won. I think most people think in Romans, justification is a legally declarative,
primarily
forensic category, right? The mental picture of a judge looking at somebody and declaring them righteous, innocent, whatever it is. That seems to be pretty standard. But it's kind of like, this is, okay, I think the Bible Project got it right. I think they were good to say justification means declared righteous. And as a result, that means you're part of a new family and you have a new future and you're in Christ.
Yeah, a new way of life, which means
a new way of life.
Right, yeah.
And this is, I like Michael Gorman, but I think he confuses categories. And
you're saying that as a result part is an important step.
Gorman says justification means new life. I think linguistically, no. Justification means justice, and it's a judicial term of being declared right, which results in a new life.
Yeah. Which traces the logic of Romans, I think.
Yeah. And it's a similar, there's a whole book critiquing N.T. Wright. It's like,
there's probably a bunch of books, actually.
I forget it. N.T. Wright has a book called Paul and the Faithfulness of God. And then there's a book that is a play off of his, I forget what it is. But there's a whole conference, you can find it online. And Kevin Van Hooser gives a talk about, what if we thought of justification in terms of adoption? Rather than a criminal court, are you guilty or not? We think of it as an adoption court. Are you in the family or not? And in the Q&A, N.T. Wright basically says, it's a good thought. It's just not what justification means linguistically. And I think it's that same idea of being careful to distinguish what a word linguistically means and then what the implications are.
And the distinction you're also drawing is between justification itself and all the implications of justification. And there is a distinction there that is often confused.
And there's a ton of implications.
To be given a new status, a new family, a new future, to be in Christ is such a huge category. And justification is sort of one of the things that means, or it's not everything.
That's the thing, is if your theme of Romans is justification by faith, which I think Luther maybe had that, and everything needs to be justification by faith, then you're going to miss like all the things that Romans talks about, becoming a new creature, right? And so to not reduce the whole argument of Romans to justification by faith, but also not to like muddle up the meaning of justification.
And again, Bible Project kind of crushed it. Did a really good job.
I thought the way that they articulated it was good. So now, what does it mean, works of the law? Is it boundary markers, or is this a stand-in for human behaviors as a whole. We cannot be saved by our own human efforts.
That's a good question. And a huge question you have to figure out methodologically, are we just reading Romans or are we allowing all of Paul to matter here? Because Ephesians, he uses the phrase not saved by works. Is that equivalent with works of the law, or is he saying any works? Scholarship will divide on that. Some will say works of the law is like a technical term that refers to these Sabbath markers, whatever, and works is a different category. Others will say, no, he doesn't have to write of the law every time. We should know it's the same thing. And again, I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I'll keep saying this, but I think it comes back to how you conceptualize law over and over again. And
how do you conceptualize law?
Well, to continue to problematize, I think Paul in Romans uses law 5 different ways. In Romans 8, he talks about the law of Christ. What does that mean? Is he referring to the Old Testament law as Christ's law? Or is he saying there's a new law in God's mind that is summarized by the life of Christ? Or is he saying the laws Christ gave? All these are legitimate renderings of that phrase, and that's just one of the phrases in Romans 8. The law of the Spirit of life is another one in Romans 8. Is that the same as Christ's law? Or in Romans 7, I find a law within myself. Is he talking about... There's just not a clear answer on what law even means. And so works of the law, I'll get back to your actual question. I tend to go towards covenantal markers of Torah.
Okay.
And that's in part, maybe because I'm not a Paul scholar, maybe because it's so complicated. At some point, you just have to pick and see if it works. And I think it kind of works for a lot of what Paul's doing to say that works of the law means these covenantal markers.
All right.
But
here's my case.
Before you push back on me, I'll also say that Paul stands against works righteousness broadly. Also, I think they're both true. I want to say both, and I realize that upsets some of these interpreters. But for example, I think Ephesians is doing something different than
you would say that they're So, man, this is a difficult conversation. But so looking at Romans 3:19, it says, "Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law." And this is right after where it says, "All are guilty, no one's righteous, no, not one." So we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. So that there isn't actually that logical. Right? The law is speaking to Jews, therefore everyone's guilty.
The whole world. Right.
And I think it's God gave the Jews the law. The most special election covenant grace given to anyone was the Jews with the law. And they're a test case that shows humans, they're not going to keep the law. Any nation, if God would have chosen them, they would have done the same thing. Right?
So Israel's representative failure stops the mouth
of everyone. And I think there's that movement of Romans 1:18 to the end of the chapter it's pointing at Greco-Roman vices and sins. Of course, we know they're guilty.
Right.
And then chapter 2, "Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you judge practice the very same things." And there he's speaking to the Jews, right, who have the law, right? But they're guilty, and yet you're doing the same thing.
Right.
And do you think you're going to escape?
Right.
And so I still think that what you're saying, even if the focus is on boundary markers, that the implications are all human behaviors. There's nothing we can do to become righteous before God. We can't live up. It is a free grace comes first.
It has to be a gift, or we can't do it. That's right.
And James Dunn says something similar in his old James Dunn was very like boundary markers.
Right.
New James Dunn is like, I never meant only boundary markers.
Right. And N.T. Wright's in the same shift. There does, I think, at least people our age grew up with being taught that there was this huge divide between new perspective, old perspective, that N.T. Wright and James Dunn were overthrowing the Reformation. And now, maybe it's just because we're learning more, or you learn more nuance. And also it's because some of these new perspective firebrand figures have softened to a certain extent. But Doug Moo and N.T. Wright disagree on very little, I think. They've drawn very close together. They still sharply disagree about those small things, but they're not divided.
It's not the same heretical.
No, they were heresy
throwing-
was thrown around. And again, Bible Project does a really good job, I think, of presenting the consensus middle ground, where they're not picking a side or alienating people. They are bringing together these things pretty well, I think.
There is a debate over the faith of Christ. Just to point this out really quick, in chapter 3, it talks about, you'll notice this, if you look at ESV, it talks about faith in Christ, where if you look at the NET, it'll say the faithfulness of Christ. And it's this pistis Christou debate. And so some take the faith in Christ, objective genitive. Some take faithfulness of Christ, that's a subjective genitive. And then there's a third way of just viewing faith of Christ as a ambiguous technical term almost, the Christ faith. So I don't know how much we're going to get into this. So the objective genitive people will often point to something like, if I was to say, oh, I saw a picture of Marilyn Monroe, you don't think, and I said, it's of her dog that she took.
Right.
Like, it's just like, you don't think of,
right.
You don't associate Marilyn Monroe as a photographer, right? You picture her as someone who, as an actress, has pictures taken of her,
Sure.
right? And so if you read Romans and Galatians, Paul, whatever, when you have faith in Christ together, you don't think of Christ doing the faith, right? You associate faith in Christ automatically. And so that's the case for the objective genitive of, if we have faith in Christ together, we automatically just think of believing in Christ.
The problem is that pistis can mean faithfulness or believing. It's
right.
Complicated.
So that's the debate between the relationship between pistuo, the verb, and pistis, the noun. And then, so the subjective genitive people will point to faith in Christ as the objective genitive is grammatically harder than possibly impossible. Some people will argue.
I was in a meeting once where Doug Moo brought that up, and he was like, if that's true, let me just list off some interpreters who apparently don't know Greek at all. And he was included in that list.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's impossible. Yeah.
So it's at least grammatically harder. For the objective genitive, the faith in Christ is grammatically harder than the subjective. And so that's good. I'm attracted to the third way of it incorporates both.
Do you have an English rendering of pistis Christi that you like for the third way?
Well, that's the thing, is I still think it's human faithfulness in Christ.
Oh.
But it's not.
There's one
faith of Christ isn't a shorthand for faith in Christ. It's a bigger way of life, like a religion, a way of
I can't remember who it is, but there's a book about allegiance, translating this as allegiance to Christ, which is like
Matthew Bates.
It's Bates.
Maybe something similar. But we're going long, so there's many things.
And we'll get into some of these themes again when we do Galatians.
Oh, Galatians will bring up all these same things. So, all right. So I guess we'll stop it there, and we will be talking about Paul for the next several weeks here. So we'll probably hit on a lot of these things. But 1 Corinthians, we're going to get into eschatology, ecclesiology, and the Eucharist here.
Stuff Paul leaves out.
So if you were hoping for that,